Last year, I posted a video about my self-watering grow beds, and it was the shoddiest video I have ever made. It was just sort of cobbled together, largely from still shots that I had lying around, and it doesn't really provide a step-by-step how-to on how to actually build one of these things. And I always felt a little badly about that. So now I'm going to present you with a step-by-step how-to video complete with a cut list, a parts list, and everything you need to know to actually build one of these. The one I built came in at about $290, but I could have really brought that down if I'd planned my lumber better. To be honest with you, I did plan out my lumber. I had everything based on a 6-foot 2x4 because that's what will fit in my car. But when I got to the store, they were fresh out of 6-foot 2x4s, so I had to pivot on the spot. And that caused me to spend a lot more money than I really needed to. So you can probably do a lot better. Now the video starts with my return from my first trip to the hardware store where I picked up a bunch of cedar pickets. I use cedar because it's a little bit more water resistant. It's not waterproof, but it'll last longer than just untreated pine. And I don't want to use treated wood, and redwood is expensive and it's a little hard on the environment, so cedar's good. I've had these 3 older beds for around 7 or 8 years now. They're made out of cedar, and they're holding up pretty darn well. I also picked up this package of 20 corner braces. I only need 4, but I end up going through these a lot. They're just, they come in handy all the time. So this 20 pack will probably be something really helpful for me in the long run. I also got a 2-inch piece of PVC pipe for the fill tube. That's 2-inch internal diameter. And then I already had this piece of extra 1/2-inch pipe that I'll use for the drain tube, so I didn't have to buy that one. But that is something that is pretty important. All right, so 6 of these pickets are being cut down to a 4-foot length. Here you go. I'm cutting the dog ear side off because that's not going to be as good looking. We'll have to settle for some of that on the side pieces, but we'll get to that later. I'm making a 4-foot length here, and I am trying to pick the better looking pieces for the ones that are going to face toward me. If I find any that I have to use that are a little bit disfigured or discolored or warped, then I'll put those on the back where the neighbor gets to look at them. So I need 6 of these cut to a 4-foot length. Now, when using any kind of power tool, including a circular saw, always wear ear protection, eye protection. Don't wear necklaces and keep long hair out of the way because if it's dangling into the tool, that can actually kill you. It's a good idea to wear gloves to keep splinters off, and closed-toe shoes are also a good idea. Now I've got my 6 4-foot sections. You might notice they're a little bit warped, but I think with the trade wars going on, it's going to be hard to find really perfect wood. But we're building a grow bed, not a piano, so it's going to be fine. It's not a Stradivarius. The 3 remaining pickets get cut into 3-foot sections, which, if you've got 6-footers like I did, that's exactly in half. With these, you just have to kind of deal with whatever, splits and slits and knots and chunks and imperfections because we have to use the whole thing, dog ear and all, and that's just what we got. But then again, we're not building a piano, we're building a garden bed. Now the first thing I'm going to do is make the legs, and I'm going to make them out of 8 2x4s that have been cut to 29 inches long. Of course, you can make them taller or shorter, just, whatever fits your you. You could also use 4x4 posts, but those are a little harder to cut, a little harder to carry around. But if you do use those, obviously, you would just need 4 pieces. Now, this next step is just as easy as it could be. I'm going to line up 2 pieces like this. I'm going to make sure they're very flush on at least one side. I'm going to, drill a pilot hole here and here and here-ish. And if I feel like I need more, then I'll do more. So I'll start with a pilot hole, and I'm going to follow that up with a 2-inch deck screw. A 2.5 might have been a little better, but if I countersink a 2-inch screw, that should be nice and solid. I promise. And there we have it. The first leg is finished, nice and tight. I've got 3 screws on here. Like I said, countersunk screws. That's going to be so solid. So I'm just going to repeat this for the next 3 legs, and then I'll have 4 very sturdy legs. And there I have it, 4 very sturdy legs. 1, 2, 3, 4. The next step is installing the rail, which is a 2x4 cut to a 4-foot length. Now, as far as the placement, it's going to depend partly on how tall you made the legs. If you've got some scraps that you cut off of the pickets, that's going to come in really handy right now, because we're going to use those to determine where to put the joist. The reason for that is, well, if you look at this one that's already built, you've got the 3 pickets here, and then that joist hits the leg at exactly the same level as the bottom of the bottom picket. So we can use those scrap pieces to measure exactly where we want to place the joist. Now in my case, I made a 29-inch leg. I put these 3 scrap pickets up there, and then I line up my joist, and I can see that that is, just by sheer luck, it is exactly 9 inches from the bottom of the leg. Now if you have a T-square, you can use that to get this joint lined up nice and square and straight on the leg, and that's something I am going to do now, but I'm here to tell you that after a good rainstorm or two, and certainly after a growing season or two, absolutely nothing about this grow bed is going to be square or straight. But I'm going to use it anyway, just because I want to at least start out with something that's as square and as straight as possible. For this, I'm going to use these 3.5-inch screws because we are going through a lot more wood. So I'm going to use 2 of these. And then I'll put a brace on the backside, but I'll show you that in a little bit. Now, since I'm just a two-handed ape, I had to do this with the camera off. But as you can see, I have sunk a couple of 3.5-inch screws in there. It's going to be pretty sturdy, but like I said, we'll back it up with the brace. So now on to the other side. So just to double check myself, I did go ahead and lay out the pickets to make sure that this side was right too. But I also used, God forbid, a measuring device to make sure that it's 9 inches, which it is. You can't see that very well, but take my word for it, it's 9 inches, just like its counterpart. And I'm not going to do this with the camera on because, like I said, I've only got 2 hands, but I am going to use my T-square to make sure it's nice and square and straight as possible, at least until the first rainfall. And there it is. I've got 2 legs with the joists running between them, and it's pretty strong, pretty sturdy, but you know what? I think it could be even stronger, so let's flip it over. Here I'm going to install a couple of braces, one here and one over here. I'm going to use 1 5/8 inch deck screws because the 3-inch screws are just going to go too far through, and then they'll be poking out the back. And we don't want that. Okay, and there we have it. We have a bracket installed. You might notice that there are only 3 screws. That's because this one landed right in the gap between the 2 pieces of wood. And this is fine. It's still going to be really sturdy. I've got it installed here and also on this side. So this is finished. I'm going to turn off the camera, make the other one, and then I'm going to lean them up on each other for the next step, which is putting in the floorboards. Now in the cut list that I'm providing, there are 2 pieces I'm calling the floor ends. Those are the floorboards that go on the 2 ends of this. They are 6 inches shorter than the rest of the floorboards. Obviously, the reason for that is that we have to have room for the legs. Now I'm designing this for a finished size of about 36 inches wide. Now that really has more to do with the fact that that's what I have room for back there. You may want to make yours a little narrower or slightly wider, but don't go too wide because the pond liner still needs to fit in here. But if you use my measurements, the floorboards will be 34 3/4 inches long, and the floor ends will be 28 3/4 inches long on the nose. Now, if there's somebody who can lend you a hand, I suggest getting them to help you get this first piece in because that first piece does need to be nice and flush and square and straight. Okay, so now the floor ends have been attached and we have a basic frame here. And we're ready to start installing the floorboards. A couple things you might notice right off the bat. One is that I have a mixture of new wood and kind of old beat up wood. That's because I grabbed as much as I could off of my scrap pile. This is not something that you are ever going to see, and it doesn't have to be perfect on oh so many levels. As I've said before, we're not building a piano, we're building a grow bed. But this is where I'm going to use my scrap wood, and that's why you have different kinds of woods in here. The other thing you might notice is that this isn't going to be a perfect fit. Let's get it in there as best we can, and then we'll come up with a couple of different solutions for that. So here I've gone ahead and roughly laid in my floorboards, but as you can see, there is about a 2¼ inch gap here. Now there are a couple of different ways we could address this. We could take another 2x4 and just trim it to fit, but that feels like a lot of work that I just don't want to do. Now I also just happen to have this piece of 1x here, and we could cut this into a few pieces and then kind of fill that in. I actually don't think I have enough to fill all of that though, so the other approach would be to just kind of spread the gap out between these 12 little spaces and see how that looks. So let's try that. And that's what it looks like when I just spread the gap out between the pieces. And to be honest with you, it's just a little bit more than I'm comfortable with. You see, once we fill the pond liner with water, it's going to be really heavy, and I can just imagine it bulging through these cracks and over time, maybe sprouting a leak or worse. So I think I'm just going to kind of hybridize the two approaches. I'm going to take this 1x and put it in there, and then we'll spread whatever's left between the pieces. And that should get us good enough. I think. Good enough. Have I mentioned, by the way, that we're not building piano? Alright, so the floorboards are now all in there screwed in, and you might notice that I only used one screw on each one because it's not going to move around. The weight of the water is really going to hold these in place. It's not load bearing, it's not structural, so it doesn't need a bajillion screws. And so now we're ready to sand. You might be tempted to skip this step, but don't. You want to make sure that there's no splinters, especially on this older reclaimed wood that I'm using. But even on the new wood, you don't want any splinters in there because that could puncture the pond liner and then you will have a very bad day. Don't wait to do this until after the sidewalls are installed because it's going to be a lot easier to clean all the stuff out if you do it before then. Now, a cheap orbital sander will work just fine, and if you're worried about the money spent on tools, don't. Tools pay for themselves. Just like kitchen equipment. So don't be afraid to invest in some decent tools, like this cheap little Black & Decker orbital sander I've had for 20 years. It's been great for me. Okay, so now I'm all sanded up, and now I'm ready to put the sidewalls on. Yeah, I'm using these little clamps to free up my hand, and also I'm going to add this little shop towel. I mean, I've always got a million of these just laying around, but there's a little knot hole in there, and I could just see the pond liner getting stuck in there, and I couldn't sand it out smoothly, so I'm going to use this as a little insurance policy. So let's go ahead and put on the sidewalls, and I'm going to use these 1 5/8 inch screws on this because they don't have a lot of distance to cover, so these are going to be fine. And thanks to the magic of video magic, I've now got all 4 sides built up, and the next step is to take some of this weed barrier and lay it across the bottom to give the pond liner a little protection from splinters and other pokeaholics. This is how I'm roughly measuring my weed barrier. I'm using some thumbtacks to kind of rough it in place and making sure that I have probably 10 or 12 inch overlap over here so that it can come up the sides a little bit. And then I'll cut it over on this end with just an ordinary pair of scissors. I'll probably do 2 layers because I don't want any Pokemons to come up here. And Franklin Pierce, my pond liner. We don't want anything to poke and haunt us. And I am using heavy duty fabric because, we really want to be serious about this. We need to make sure that nothing pierces our pierces our pond liner. Okay, so around this time, we want to start being mindful of where things are and where they're going to end up. We don't have to be exact or precise, but we do want to be mindful. The placement of the pond liner and the water level is going to end up roughly leaving us about 10 inches of soil. So it's going to come up roughly to this seam right here. Now that could change, it probably will, but that's where we want to start envisioning things. And one of the reasons for that is that we want to make sure we never ever put a staple below the water line, and especially in the pond liner below the water line, because that will cause a leak. So I don't even want the staples to be like pressing up against the outside of the pond liner with all the pressure of the water. So just be really careful to never put staples below the water line. I'm going to say that like 50 more times, and try to make sure that we're always leaving room for about 10 inches of soil for the plants to grow in. Okay, here's 2 layers, and as you can see, it's not the least bit exact or tidy, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be exact or tidy or neat. This just has to sit under the pond liner to keep it from getting Pokemoned. Now I'm ready to measure and cut my pond liner. This was sold to me on Amazon as a 10 by 7, and it's not quite 7, and I'm feeling a little bit ripped off, but not for that reason. Actually, the reason I'm feeling a little bit ripped off is because the pond liners I bought in the past for my older grow beds were like 3 or 4 times the cost at the local garden center. I love supporting local businesses. I really go out of my way, and I don't even mind paying a little more. But yeah, like close to 4 times the cost at my local garden center than I paid for this. And so I just feel dirty. So anyway, I'm going to cut this to about 12 inches larger than my internal dimensions on both sides. And those internal dimensions are 35 inches on the width. And then you just have to take my word for it. It's 48 on the length. And I'm going to add 1 foot to each of those. So we're going to be at 47 on the width and 60 on the length. You might be tempted to fudge that number a little bit, but don't, because it's actually based on the diameter of the pipe. You'll see what I'm talking about. And I cut it pretty much exactly in half, which means that I now have another piece of pond liner, which is cut to be a pretty much perfect fit for a second grow bed. That's great. All right, the next step is to pop that pond liner into the grow bed. You want it to be pretty centered. Again, this doesn't have to be exact, but you want it to be fairly centered. And I'm going to say this several more times, never put a staple below the water line. And on that note, the water line is going to go up about 5 inches because of the pipe. So you want to make sure that you have at least 5 inches of pond liner up every wall. And then you can put your staples above that water line. And in fact, I'm going to cut a test piece of tubing right now just to make sure that this thing is where I need it to be. I've cut this to about 46 inches because I don't want it to be too tight. I don't want to have to squeeze and mash this in there. 46 is about right. Now that I've verified that size it works, I've cut 3 more pieces, but I actually went down to like 45-ish inches because I'd rather have these be slightly small so that they aren't like fussy when I try to put them in there. Okay, I verified I have pond liner that comes up to what will be above the water line, so now I can start putting in some staples. And have I mentioned this yet? Never put a staple below the water line. So I'm going to put them up in here, and it doesn't have to be super tight because once the weight of the water and the soil and everything goes in there, then it'll keep it in place pretty well. But that being said, use more staples than you think you need and then fill it with water like this, with all the staples in water, and let that sit overnight, which I have now done. It's now the following day, and this has been sitting here since last night, holding water, and holding is indeed what it has done. The water has held, so that means I don't have any leaks. An additional benefit to doing this is that I can get all these little poker players that have floated to the top. And sorry about the finger, but I can scoop these out now, which means that I will have less chance of puncturing later on. Yeah, finger nice. That's great. But another side benefit of doing that is that any chemicals that were left on the pond liner in the manufacturing process, to some degree, will now have been rinsed off. I'm going to siphon off this water now and try and think of something productive I can do with it. But you know what? It was worth it because I'm going to grow a lot of food. But once you've drained all the water off and allowed it to dry up, make a hole just above where the water line is going to be. I used this 1-inch bit hole cutter thingamabob. I think that's the technical word. But anyway, I'm going to use that to place a hole, which is where I'm going to put the smaller piece of PVC. That's going to be the drain pipe. And I want it to stick out, 2 or 3 inches. It doesn't have to be exact. And I'm not going to actually install this completely yet, but I do want that hole to be cut. Now it's time to start cutting our final pieces of perforated tubing. I sometimes call it sewer pipe, but I don't think we're supposed to use that word anymore. Anyway, you probably have these 2 leftover pieces, and we'll trim them down a little bit, but they're helpful for sizing this up. You're going to take your new piece, your uncut piece, and cut off 2 10-inch pieces and 1 16-inch piece. And you'll notice that those 3 pieces, along with the 2 long ones, fits perfectly right there in the middle. Now let's put all of the tubing in. And here they are all laid in there. The tubes are going to serve a number of functions. For one, they're going to ensure that the water flows freely down in the reservoir. 2, they're going to provide some support of the weight of the soil and the plants and the squirrels and their poop and their egos. I mean, not solely, but they're going to be one of the things that holds all of that up. They're going to contribute some of the support. And 3, as we're building, they help us kind of visualize the structure of this whole thing. And that is helpful, actually, just being able to see how it's all coming together. Now we're going to take one of these extra pieces and we're going to cut a couple of 1-foot sections off of it. We can get both of those cut off of just one of these. And those 1-foot sections are going to be our wicks. The wicks are the things that draw the water from the reservoir up into the soil via capillary action. And there we have the basic structure of all the tubing. These 1-foot pieces are going to be just about, hopefully about 3 inches below the soil line. I'll probably cut them down a little bit lower, but not a whole lot. Now we're going to fill these with soil, and then they're going to draw water up from the bottom, and then it's going to wick into our grow beds. You might have noticed that I've got my fill tube here. I'm going to cut it down to size, but I'm also going to drill some pretty sizable holes along the bottom. You do need those to make sure that the water can get out. I made the mistake of not putting those holes in one of my fill tubes once, and now I can't get the water to come through that one unless I kind of pull it up while I'm filling it. It really makes a big difference. All right, so to make the holes in the fill tube, you're going to need a drill bit, and the size you need is kind of about like this one, sort of exactly. And the number of holes you need to make needs to be really precise. You make a bunch of them. Okay, you might want to write that down, a bunch. And there we go. I think where I ended up with this is a few. I ended up with a few holes. So make sure you put some holes in there. And I think maybe you need a bunch of holes. That's about right. Now we're about ready to do what is, I have to admit, my least favorite part of this whole project. We're going to fit the chicken wire. Before we do that, we need to remove the wick tubes, so get this out of the way. Now we need to size up our chicken wire. Now, if you've built to the same dimensions as I have, you're going to be pleased to know that chicken wire generally comes in 3-foot rolls, and that's about exactly what we want. We want our chicken wire to be just bigger than the hole we're putting it in, because we need to have just enough chicken wire to have something to staple to the sides. Once again, I'm going to remind you, never put a hole from your staple, a nail, screw, or otherwise below the water line. So let's get the length sized up. Because as you can see, I'm enlisting these pieces of scrap wood to hold my chicken wire in place. Now we want this chicken wire to be pretty close to the right size, because we want to make it as tight as we can possibly get it. Now, if you think of the chicken wire as having like cells, kind of like, a honeycomb or something in these cells, if you consider the fact that this is going to be where the interior of the grow bed is, I want 2 full cells that I have to play with to attach it down to the bottom. And we don't want much more than that. I mean, if anything, on the side of too many, yes, but we don't want a whole bunch of scrunched up chicken wire under there. That's going to be a mess. So let's go over here, and I have to do this off camera now, but I'm going to pull this as tight as I can and then leave myself about 2 cells of extra on each side, which I can then attach to the interior of the grow bed with staples, more than you think you need. Now I have cut the chicken wire to what I hope is the correct size, and I'm going to get it down in there and start attaching it with a staple gun. And this step, we want to overbuild. We want to use way more staples than we think we need. So the first few staples we put in are really important, because everything is going to be basically based on that. We want the width to be close to where we want it at the end of the day. And by the way, there will be some excess. We will have a little bit of excess on the ends and the sides, and that's a good thing. We're going to cut that off. It's going to be a pain, but it's better to have too much than too little. So make sure that the width-wise placement is about right, and that we're attaching the top 1 or 2 cells. And we want that to be really secure. Again, we're going to put in way more staples than we think we need. And as we go along, any bulges like this, we want to make sure are behind the chicken wire, and we don't want to put any staples under the water line. Now, that being said, remember that a lot of the pond liner is above what will actually be the water line. But we need to get these first few staples to be really, really overdone because they're going to be taking on a lot of the tension as we build. Now, I've got 8 good staples in there, and I dropped one in, and it made me think, make sure to pull any staples that fall out. Get them out of there. Don't have loose staples floating around down in the reservoir, because those could, pierce and McIntyre your pond liner. You don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to start with these 8, and then you're going to have a little bit of buckling with the pond liner. Try to minimize that. There's going to be some, you can't get around that, but try to minimize the amount of buckling under the chicken wire. Okay, so now the chicken wire is all stapled in, and however many staples you think you need, add more. Have I mentioned I really hate working with chicken wire? Anyway, so now we're going to cut a hole here. We're going to cut a hole here. We're going to move this pipe over and put a hole here for the drain tube. And we're going to cut off the excess that we ended up with. As I said, we would have a little extra, not too much, but we don't want a lot of excess chicken wire cluttering up the thing. I hate chicken wire. And now I've placed all of our tubes and pipes where they need to go, but they're not going to stay there for long because the next step is to put in a layer of weed barrier, which is going to hold the soil. And if this seems a little loose, don't worry about it. It's okay. It's just we want it as tight as we can get it, but it is still going to be a little loose. It's okay. We're not building a piano. Now, the garden fabric, aka weed barrier, can be a lot less exact. We actually do want it to come up roughly almost to the top of the walls. Not exactly all the way, but we just want it to come up pretty high. So I'm going to actually lay this fabric onto the grow bed, and then we'll cut it after I've got it stapled in. It would have been weird for me to get this far into a project without making any mistakes, and I'm glad I caught this one before I went any further, but this perforated tubing has no perforations. There's no holes in there whatsoever. No way for the water to get in. I could have swore I read the sign, but who knows? I mean, the big box store is not without its mistakes too, but I don't care. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. I'm just going to fix it by taking my trusty drill, and very much like I did with the fill tube, I'm going to put some holes in here. The bit size is just the next one down from what I used before. I want the holes to be big enough to where water can get in, but the soil doesn't come back out. And there I have my now perforated wick tubes. As far as I know, there's no actual laboratory testing to tell you the optimum number or size of holes, so I used, like I said, the one size down from the holes I'd made in the fill tube, and then I went down another 2 sizes and made another course of holes. So I've got 2 courses on this size and 2 courses of this size. Hopefully that's going to work. I did it, I'll be honest, pretty much just by gut. Like I said, the idea is that you want water to get in, but you don't want soil sneaking out and getting into your water. There's going to be some, no matter what you do, but I hopefully got a decent-sized hole here. If I haven't mentioned this already, this is a good time to mention that. Some of you may be, and rightly so, wondering about all the embedded materials and energy in this grow bed. Because it is. It's a lot of plastic. It's a lot of weed barrier. It's a lot of wood and chicken wire. But if you start paying attention to all the materials that are in all the food you buy at the grocery store, all the packaging, not to mention the transportation. In fact, I have a factoid that for every calorie of food you buy at the store, it takes 15 calories to transport that to your store. Not to mention when you burn more calories getting it home. So I like to think in a couple seasons, this pays for itself, not only in embedded energy, but also in the cost of the food. So there's my justification. All right, upward and onward. So now I've got my weed barrier, garden cloth, whatever you want to call it, in there, stapled in nice and secure, nice and taut. This is another place where It's a good idea to be really generous with the staples. We want lots of staples in here because that's going to hold our soil in place. I've trimmed up a little bit in here in the corners where it was jutting up just above the frame. We don't want it poking up, but we do want it to be pretty securely in there. I should take care of that little dimple there because we don't want the soil to be like falling down like those little crevasses. So there we go. Now the next thing we're going to do is cut some holes in the cloth and make some skirts. You'll see what I mean in the next couple of shots. And we don't want to cut a hole, by the way, for the overflow tube because that actually goes underneath the ground cloth. In fact, if I can, I'm going to get that to sort of hook under the chicken wire because we want that down below the soil where it can grab the water that is overfilling. And that's pretty much going to do it for part 1. We'll finish up in the next episode. As promised, here's the parts list. Now I know that it's a little hard to read for a lot of you, so let's go ahead and zoom in on the left 3 columns because those are the ones that you probably care the most about. And there, that's a little better, and I'll leave this up for a while so you have time to take a screenshot or maybe snap a picture with your phone. And speaking of phones, I get that those of you who are watching on a phone still probably can't read that very well. So if you want me to send this to you as a doc or a spreadsheet or something that you can open on your computer, just go ahead and drop me an email at eatislovetv@gmail.com. That's eatislovetv@gmail.com. You can also find that email address on the homepage of this channel, and we'll get the rest of this posted in a week or two. And, word to the wise, if you'd like to know when I am posting the next installment, the best way to find out is to go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you'll be alerted when all of my fascinating videos get posted. But for now, it's time to wrap up this video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. Ciao.